It's a pleasure to have with us today, again, our senior scholar, Bryan Caplan. Bryan is a professor at George Mason University and a scholar with the Salem Center, where he writes our blog on Substack, Bet on It. Bryan, of course, is an author of numerous books. Let me just read here quickly from a very long list, but I remember some of them from the top of my head. Um, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, The Case Against Education, Open Borders, um, Build Baby Build, which is going to come up next this later this year, and The Myth of the Rational Voter, Voters as Mad Scientists, Labor Econ versus the World, Don't Be a Feminist, How Evil Are Politicians, and finally today we're going to be talking about his latest addition to this series of books that features his essays from his blog over the last 20 years or so, called "You Will Not Stampede Me: Essays on Non-Conformism." So, Bryan, welcome to Salem again to talk about
Awesome to
this.
see you, brother.
Yeah, always great to see you. So, first, let's tell the people here today about these books, the series of books that you started over the past like a couple of years now, where both basically the one on "Don't Be a Feminist," Labor Econ Against the World, How Rational Are Voters, How Evil Are Politicians, sorry, and what was the last one is the one that we're talking about today, How You Will Not Stampede Me.
Yeah, so about 3 years, I realized that I had written about 2,000 blog posts for EconLog, and that they were read at the time, and they were somewhere in an archive, but probably no one was ever going to read them again, or at least very few people. I then had the idea. Actually, I received a set of books as a present from Less Wrong, where they had physically published a bunch of their favorite blog posts into books, and I read those and I said, wow, I never would have read these if they were only on the blog, but because they went and picked their very best things, put them into a physical book form, I wound up reading them. I liked the idea, so I just went through all 2,000 of the posts or so that I'd written, and I just started putting down titles that I thought were worth still reading today, the ones that had stood the test of time. And then I made up a giant spreadsheet and tried to figure out a good way to organize them, what headings. And well, one thing I've been writing about for a long time is non-conformism, which is near and dear to my heart. I have been not conforming for a really long time, got a lot of pieces that are relevant to it, and I figured I'd put them between two covers. So that's where we are.
How was the process? And like when reading things back from years and years and years of blog posting, did you like, oh my God, I can't believe I wrote this? Or mostly you're like, ha, I'm so right.
Yeah, I've always had an issue with arrogance. It's a sickness. I get a lot of pleasure from rereading my old stuff. It's like finally someone's saying it just right. And like every now and then I actually forget that I wrote it and I'm nodding along like, oh wow, this guy's oh wait, it's me. All right.
That's great.
I just gotta be honest. That is me. I'm real proud of what I do normally. It's very rare that I look at something and I just say like, what in the world was I thinking? I mean, every now and then they'll be like, well, of course I couldn't foresee that there's going to be the Ukraine invasion or something like that. There's things that almost nobody foresaw, and don't beat myself up or over it. But normally I think I do pretty good. I think a lot of it is precisely that I'm such a big fan of betting. So I do, when I'm writing sentences, wonder, well, I'm like, this committing me to some bet, and what would it be? And do I really know?
We're gonna talk on that, touch on that a little bit later today. So hold your thought on bets there. So tell us about specifically this book. I mean, how would you sort of like describe the theme of these essays and what the process of being a nonconformist?
So when I was in high school, they were still assigning Emerson's essay on self-reliance and also Thoreau's essay on the duty of civil disobedience. You might think it's weird that high schools be promoting nonconformity because they're totally conformist and there's no room really to actually apply what they are teaching you. But still, those essays really stood with me. I mean, mostly just because they spoke to what I was already doing and how I already felt. When I was in high school, I had a lot of the classic nonconformist problems of not really thinking through what are the things I can get away with, what are the things I can't get away with, how can I find out which things are on which side of the ledger. In doing this blogging for about 20 years, a lot of this is capturing what I did learn over time. I did get better at figuring out what can I get away with, what can I not get away with. And the list of what you can get away with is surprisingly long, actually. I mean, a lot of it comes down to as long as you check the right educational boxes, that's the one area where we are least tolerant of dissent. Like you just cannot become a professor without a PhD. It doesn't matter how awesome you are. But other than that, the room is very broad to be yourself and live a better life.
So that in that particular category, you're right that we cannot be professors. We cannot have a tenure track job, be tenure professor somewhere without a PhD. And people think about PhDs as being places where people can be very creative and really, go away from the just create ideas that are not necessarily in the mainstream or something. Like be very free to think and innovate. And that's not true. In fact, it's perhaps the opposite. People have to be pretty conformist about when creating something that will qualify as a PhD thesis accepted by a department to then get a job, right? So was that a hard process for you, being that you had that the general disposition, or not quite?
I mean, what I would say is that once you have tenure, that's where you really are totally free to be a nonconformist. It's really a selection issue at that point. The people that make it that far normally are quite conformist. Yeah, like how hard it was for me, it wasn't
Like
that
at
bad.
Princeton, how hard was it, Princeton, to be
Yeah,
a student to
that was
finish
yeah,
your
that
degree?
was that was probably the hardest. It's the place where I was getting the fewest pats on my head from teachers and things like that. I was definitely bored during the first year required classes, especially where it is just sort of a math camp where they like even people who would never really defend the math that you're learning as actually necessary to understanding economics, it's still you have to learn it because I had to learn it. I had to learn it because my teachers had to learn it. I didn't feel like people were getting mad at me for asking contrarian questions, and I always do. I mean, partly just to stay awake, honestly. If I'm bored, I'll just say, oh, I got to ask a question or I'm going to fall asleep here. The flexibility really does vary a lot. So, like, there are some people who remain nameless where they'll just glower at you if you start saying this material really worth learning. And there's other professors who are like, yeah, I see where you're coming from. I don't really think that it's that worthwhile anyway. Like, what do we actually do with general equilibrium theory? But you kind of have to know it just to be part of this profession so that you fit in and so you understand what other people are talking about. Also, you have to study it just to be able to judge for yourself whether it's worthwhile. So there is that. Yeah, but I would say that PhD was the hardest part. I had lots of fun as an undergraduate. That was probably the best experience, really, because the workload was so low. And then high school was in between. I was subjected to a whole lot of drudgery. Same time, I did have a few teachers that really encouraged me, besides all the others that, it was never that anyone just said, I'm going to discourage you. It's more just boring me to death and not caring whether I was enjoying it or not. But yeah, I mean, overall, I would say that my classroom experience was not bad. So, like if you are someone that actually likes learning things, then teachers are often pretty gratified by that. And if you just go and do the work, like get a pat on your head, that feels good.
So why, you study a lot of psychology from a lot of different perspectives in all your work, actually. And why are people have such a tendency of being conformist? What's your take on
I
it?
think if you ignore evolutionary psychology, there's just no way to explain it. You really need that evolutionary psychology. You got to remember that human beings evolved in these bands of 20 to 40 people, where, first of all, of course, you got to work together on things like hunting, but also there just isn't a lot of privacy. There's not a lot of space. So if someone just starts doing things that are different, people are very quick in a primitive society to point it out and say, like, get away from this person. It is worth pointing out that if you're in this very tough survival environment and you start doing things that are unusual, well, most unusual things are going to be bad for survival. So I think it's also pretty functional for people to be nervous about nonconformism in a environment of high scarcity, and also one where there's just very little progress. So like we can see from archaeology that you'll see tool innovation happening at the rate of one good new tool coming every 10,000 or 50,000 years. An environment like that, the odds that some nonconformist actually has a good idea is quite low. So it does make sense that people are cautious. And then also, and on top of that, remember the basic feature of evolutionary psychology is sexual selection. You want to go and mate with someone that's doing weird things. Like that might make babies that do weird things, which are also being selected against. So hold on, let's be careful about this. So that is obviously one of the main motives of kids in high school and college to be conformist is I don't want to go and look weird because otherwise girls won't like me. Right? To a lesser extent, but still, I don't want to look weird because boys won't like me. This, I would think, is just so deeply rooted in human nature. It's, and you can see this with little kids. Sort of one rule of evolutionary psychology is look for traits that emerge at a very early age, and especially traits where parents keep fighting you and the kid doesn't want to listen. Like, why does the kid not want to listen? Because the parents know something about the real world and the kid is just convinced he's still in the ancestral environment. Why is it so important to kids that some other kids like them? Their parents say, you're never going to see these people after a few years. But the kid still has his mindset formed by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, where whatever is your friend group as a kid is your friend group when you're an adult, and that's it. So if you get low status as a kid, that's messing you up for your whole life. It's why they're fighting to not be at the bottom. Otherwise, not only do you have this crummy life, but no mating. You are you are in the unmateable category. So I think that is so much of the story, that this has evolved into us. It's not something that comes naturally to people to do something different. Instead, the normal human thing is to be looking around at other people and saying, well, am I doing something different? I better not, I better fit in.
So you talk about this difference between non-conformist to contrarian.
Mm-hmm.
Explain what you mean by that, and explain the process of being a non-conformist.
So the contrarian is someone who you say X and they say not X. I'm thinking here of Tyler Cowen, my good friend, where if you can even agree with him and he'll start arguing against you because he just enjoys that. Non-conformity is more of when you just aren't really paying much attention to what it is that is the normal thing. Sometimes then you independently wind up deciding that the normal thing is fine. Other times, though, you say, well, wait a second, just because most people are doing this doesn't mean that I should do it too. So that what I so anyway, I think of non-conformism does not require, it's not just a reflexive doing the opposite of what other people are doing. It's more of a deliberate apathy about what is the standard thing to do, or that's probably too strong, but at least turning down the dial of how much weight you put on nobody else is doing this thing. So even though our environment is very different from the ancestral one, still often we do learn something from looking at what other people are doing. Like if you're standing in line and suddenly everyone leaves the line, you've got to be pretty foolish to say, well, who cares about that? That doesn't prove anything. It does convey some information. It is wise when you see that no one else is going to stay in that line to think that maybe the reason to be in the line has disappeared. Yet at the same time, sometimes you've got very good information. Like, oh, no one else seems to care. No one's wearing shorts here. It's really hot and uncomfortable. Why aren't they? And well, maybe they're not doing it just because nobody else is doing it, but I want to be comfortable. And what's the harm of me doing what makes me happy in front of a bunch of total strangers who will never do anything else with me again? There's no reputation, there's no repeat, so I'll do it.
So in the realm of ideas, being a nonconformist, one way I would like you to sort of separate and try to characterize this, is it a matter of coming to an issue, coming to a problem, for example, with a more vague prior than perhaps others that by virtue of being in a group or a tribe come into that issue with a certain prior that might be less diffuse and therefore they're more prone to be not updating, right? Or is that primarily a fact that, and therefore, let's say the nonconformist and the conformist both see the same likelihood, but because they have different priors, they end up with different posteriors, or somehow the process of updating through the likelihood is somehow messed up for the conformist. What do you see the difference being?
Right. So the Bayesian take on nonconformism, I think a lot of it starts with the priors, where conformists start with the prior of if it's unpopular, it's probably wrong. Nonconformists at least start with a weaker belief in that and say, well, all right, maybe things that are unpopular have a tendency to be wrong, but it's not that strong of a tendency. So I think that's part of it. Another big part is that nonconformists just don't care so much how other people react. I think a lot of times when you talk to conformists off the record, they'll make a lot of concessions and they'll say, all right, fine, you're actually correct about this, but that doesn't change a goddamn thing. I'm still going to do the conformist thing. I don't want other people looking at me. I've talked to many economists who publish very normal research. And when I ask them, like, do you think this is really worthwhile? And is this actually fascinating? Do you think this is blazing new trails into our understanding of the human condition? They'll say, no, of course not. I mean, there's a guy that's most of his papers are using calibration methods. And I said, does the economy really work that way? And he said, no, it's a religion. Right? Then why are you doing it? Gets me publications. I've gotten that reaction a lot of times. So this is one where it isn't even so much that they are disagreeing with me as it just isn't that important to them what's literally true and what's not. It's more of what do I need to say in order to get ahead. So that's, I think, a lot of what's going on. Uh, I mean, probably also conformists just exaggerate how negative people's reactions are because they just don't try to see. Again, like another possibility is, well, maybe they're right for them and I'm right for me. You got to concede that. So if all your friends are conformists, maybe you get a really negative reaction and you're correct in thinking you'll get a negative reaction. Whereas if you have self-selected into a less conformist group, then you say, hey, I don't see what all these negative consequences are. There is that. Still, I've often noticed that conformist people spend a lot of time thinking about what complete strangers think. And I say, who cares? What difference does it make? And that's where there's just some gut level voice of evolution saying there's no such thing as a true stranger.
So you talk a lot about in your work, in various parts of your work, about this notion of don't listen to what people say, but rather what they do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, with your preferences being this sort of really important way to, like, actions speak louder than words.
Yep, they
And that's
do.
true. Lots of different areas. So do you think this tendency of conformism is mostly a signal
Mm-hmm.
thing, or without the way people talk and maybe
Mm-hmm.
project ideas versus how they act, or even in their actions, doesn't that being something that bleeds into it?
People are definitely more conformist in word than in deed. If you watch what people do, especially when they think nobody's looking, there's all kinds of eccentricities that people will wind up indulging. Whereas to open up your mouth and say the eccentric thing, that's pretty strong. So the idea of this, so I think, in other words, I think you are correct that people are not as conformist as they say, and much of it is a signal where it's like, well, I don't want other people to know there's something weird about me. At the same time, I don't want to be uncomfortable. So how do I balance these two things? On the other hand, the idea that people are not being conformist indeed at all, or that that's not a major factor, that's just wrong. Like I said, some of it is reasonable. You look around, and if the line suddenly disappears, you can reasonably infer that, say, the box office is closed or something like that. But still, I will say that adults, like children, just have trouble really fully appreciating that we're in this modern anonymous environment. We're no longer in a band of 20 to 40 people. And therefore, most people actually are strangers that have opinions that don't make any difference for your life one way or the other.
So if that's true, I mean, I do agree with that's true, but wouldn't that generate a lot of market opportunities?
Mm-hmm.
The fact that people are
Yeah.
acting in a conformist sense, and therefore, things that actually are value, that actually would be useful to do, are in lower supply, and therefore, one could take advantage of it.
Absolutely. And a lot of the point of this book is to say, take advantage of it. Use your own two eyes and try to figure out what are the things that I could do that I really want to do that are not popular and not condoned by society, but I could totally get away with them, enrich my life.
Or wouldn't that lead to an equilibrium where the non-conformist, becomes the conformist thing? That's
the main problem there is if you start off with a strong psychological bias in one direction, then the fact that there's opportunities means that equilibrium, more people take advantage of them, but it doesn't mean it's going to break it down to zero. Here's I think the best way of thinking about it. So we've got this economics of discrimination, and this says, look, if it really were true that women are paid 30 cents on the dollar less for equally good work, then an employer should just fire all their men, replace them all with women, and make a massive profit. And in the long run, this is going to mean that women are going to get paid based on their productivity. It's a great argument, but it does not apply nearly as well in the mating market because there it is one-on-one interaction. And so while there is a cost to saying, I won't ever date Albanians, it's not that big of a cost because there isn't you don't have this option of unlimited expansion that you would have with a business. And so it's very reasonable to think that discrimination is much more durable in the mating market where it's about dyadic pairing, two people pair up. Whereas I was like, it's what's the right way of putting it? It's not like one person is going to start dating 100 people that are otherwise neglected, whereas a business really might hire 100 people that are otherwise not being hired. Same thing is going on with conformity. I think a lot of business models actually are precisely about non-conformity. Think about what people would have said to the first person who wrote online dating apps. It must have been, oh, this is really weird. This isn't the right way to meet people. Like people aren't going to want to do it. And you're going to look weird. And it's kind of creepy that you're even trying to use a computer to do this kind of thing. What's wrong with you? There were probably a number of people who were deterred from it by this. But the ones that actually founded the successful businesses, they persevered, they made piles of money. Eventually, what they did is they normalized something that had previously been abnormal. So they were able to make profit off of it. So I think this is generally true, but for business ideas, it's also just more likely that someone else has already said, hey, I can make a pile of money. I don't care what people think. So you don't need most people to be open-minded for business to work. You just need a large enough absolute number for all the businesses that are profitable to happen, or at least a large share of them. So I think that's most of what's going on, is that in business, sure, there's a huge gain, but it doesn't require that many people to take advantage of it. And then as individuals, you can't do this thing where you just take over the market as you might in business by applying a superior method.
So changing gears a little bit, a lot of what you spoke about so far in terms of the sort of psychological tendencies that we have for conformity and so on, one would think that that would apply less so to elites, in the sense that, you know, if you are highly educated, if you are on the top of a pyramid, right, you have more of a freedom to be like, no, I'll look at the evidence, I'll make a judgment, and I'll do what is the right, you know, what the information is giving me, as opposed to do, you know, look on my side and decide what my next of kin tells me that I should do, right? So you think that's the case. And it turns out that a lot of the things that you write about, not only in this book, but in your career, but are things that reject a lot of elite views of the situation. So do you have anything to say before we go into issues specifically? Sure. Anything about elites and how are they more or less susceptible to this notion of conformity?
There is an old saying that says that the poor are weird and the rich are eccentric. So and there's something to that, right? So if you are really rich, people will just go and humor you because they want your money and they want to associate with other rich people. So there is that. But I think you're also correct that there is this list of elite opinions that are especially familiar to us and probably especially odious to us. So one thing that I'm doing in this book and in the whole series is challenging elite opinions that I disagree with. Now, whether that means that elites are especially conformist, on balance, I don't think so. It's more like most people just don't want to have a conversation about ideas at all. And therefore, it doesn't really come up that they have closed-minded views. I mean, if I did have some weird idea and I was trying to sell it, I mean, if there was someone who was elite and they were very dogmatically woke, then I would say, yeah, that's hopeless. But it was just someone who was elite and they'd gone to the best schools, but they weren't especially outspoken. I would say, well, probably the person has a lot of woke ideas. And at the same time, this doesn't mean that they are going to be a hard person to have a conversation with. So whereas someone less elite might actually get angry, or even they might even get physically upset by you saying something that is unconventional. So in the end, I would say I'd still feel more comfortable with a randomly selected elite and selling them on something that is non-conformist, while admitting that the elite just has higher variance. And so probably the people that are the most dogmatic protectors of the official doctrine are elite. At the same time, doesn't mean that the average elite is especially conformist. And like there's also the point of, well, what you're conforming to varies. So if you are part of a subculture where you know what the rules are, then you're very mindful of, well, these people don't want you to do all these things. If you wander over to another subculture where you don't know what the rules are, you might feel like you're totally free to do whatever you want. And yet they are silently there saying, what in the world is wrong with this person? I remember when I was in Japan, which is often seen as a very conformist society, I came back and I said, like, I didn't see anyone really getting upset at me for breaking all their different rules. And then a common response is, well, it's because you're oblivious, Bryan, because the Japanese don't condemn people in such an obvious way. But trust me, they are very quietly judging you. And my reaction is, all right, if true, why should I care?
Especially if you don't see it, right?
Yeah, like if they're like, he's the most horrible man who ever lived. I can't believe that he's in our country ruining it. They don't say.
I can't believe he's not using the plastic gloves in the buffet.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go through a list of non-conforming things that you wrote about, and so I have a long one here because
All right, let's do it.
You specialize in it, but so I want you to tell me a little bit about the main argument and the evidence maybe that got you to that argument, and we'll go like one by one. So, whether or not one should vote.
Yeah.
So what is the again, when I say this, like say, okay, well, my, your view, the contrarian view is like, no, you shouldn't. And then, whatever, they'll go like that.
And my view is actually more subtle than that. There is just a standard economist view that selfishly speaking, there's no point in doing it. And that's true. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, well, there's a lot of things that selfishly speaking, there's no point in doing it, but you still think that you should do it because you're not a totally selfish person. What I say about voting is different. So first of all, there is this Jason Brennan argument of it's, even if you go and take account of everybody's interests, still normally taking the energy that you put into voting and using it to make some extra money and spend it on malaria nets or some other effective altruist cause is a better contribution to humanity. There's that. There's also the question of, do I in fact know better than the typical voter? That's one where I think I do, but Brennan points out, well, most people don't know better than the typical one, and those people would be making a better contribution by just not doing it. And then, finally, I just admit that I find the whole process so ugly that I would have to have just a much higher probability for it to be psychologically worthwhile for me. Right. So here I said, look, if it were a question of you can go and risk your life to kill Hitler and you got a 20% chance of success, the von Stauffenberg plot, that's something where it's like, all right, maybe I'll do this because there's enormous good. I and I alone am ready to go and make this difference. On the other hand, for voting, I feel like, look, not only is it not likely to make a difference, but I'm definitely going to really suffer psychologically by being part of this madhouse that is an election. So that's why I say that I don't do it.
Education.
Yeah. For education, I do have this whole book, The Case Against Education, where I say that the actual main payoff from education doesn't come from learning useful job skills. It comes from signaling that you are, first of all, smart, second of all, hardworking, and third of all, conformist. It's the very thing that is in the subtitle of this book. So it is non-conformist just to call attention to this fact. I've noticed most people off the record will say, yeah, it's actually true. Of course, you're right. But we don't go around saying that. We don't want kids to find out. And when I talk to my kids, they're like, what's the harm of them finding out? I'm not saying that there isn't a payoff. I'm explaining the payoff is different from what they think. And they should be keeping their eyes open to find out, well, the things that aren't really useful for me to know and where no one will ever find out if I don't do them and I don't like them. And then I could get away with it, get away with not doing it. And that does very well describe my own educational path. I often had classes I didn't like, and it's like, all right, what's the minimum I can do in order to not mess up my future? And I would do that, just trying to get to just a little bit above the A minus in a school where we didn't really have A minuses. So get the lowest possible A in order to not waste any more of your life than you have to. These are the precious minutes of your life getting drained away doing some of the most soul destroying things that you can do. So yeah, that's most of what I say about education.
So just to summarize that argument, as a society, should we spend more money or less money on education?
Yeah, of course, the main theme of the case against education is we should spend less. I'm not really pushing individuals to do less education, although I do tell people to be mindful about what their chance of success is, what their graduation probability is, because there's so much propaganda about everyone should do it, and that is wrong. A lot of people are statistically expected to not finish, and for them, it is a bad investment. But the main thing I push is educational austerity. It is not, contrary to popular belief, a good way for societies to get rich. It's mostly a wasteful rat race. As you might guess, this is a non-conformist thing to say because almost everyone will say, well, we need to have more and better education. Like, no, we need to, less is better. We need less, a lot less.
It's definitely a bipartisan issue. Like they might want to spend in different ways, but they all want to spend more, right? Parenting.
Right. So I got another book, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, where I build on research on twins and adoptees to try to answer this long-standing question: why do people turn out the way that they do? For thousands of years, people talked about nature versus nurture, but almost always just with pure assertion, just saying, like, obviously it's genetics, obviously it's upbringing. All right, great. We can just go and assert our opinions as fact, and that gets us really far, right? Not really. But starting around 1960, there were a lot of different kinds of scientists in different fields who said, well, wait a second. The reason why we haven't made any progress so far really is because in the typical family, nature and nurture are seamlessly intertwined. But there are unusual families, families that adopt, families with twins, where nature and nurture actually distinguishable. They then went and applied these methods to try to understand a lot of different outcomes. Punchline is that it turns out that nature, and especially in the long run, does crush nurture. One side was basically right, another side was basically wrong within the observed range. It's important to add that. So this is not saying that you can dump your baby off at a Haitian orphanage and they'll turn out fine, but rather within the range of what we typically see. All this research is done in the first world. It really doesn't make very much difference what the family that raises you is like. What really matters for adult outcomes is overwhelmingly genetics, right? And then for parenting, what this means is, well, is there something that I don't like, something the kid doesn't like? Not likely to have any long run benefit, so don't do it. This doesn't resolve the question of, well, let's see, well, it very easily resolves the question, what if you like it and your kid likes it? Well, then you don't need long run benefit to do it, so enjoy. You want to go and play Dungeons and Dragons? You don't need to have some weird theory about how Dungeons and Dragons will turn your kid into a genius. Just go and play the game and have fun. You know, the only real question is, yeah, but what if you don't like it and your kid does? How much of a sacrifice should you make? It's like, well, if you know there's not much of a long run benefits, then some, but yeah, don't ruin your life over it. You already gave this little person the gift of life. It's not like you owe them or anything. I've actually gotten people angry at me younger times where I said, look, I don't care how good my kid is at ice skating. I'm not going to wake him at 4 a.m. so they can be in the Olympics. When people say, that's terrible. How can you say such a thing? It's like, look, what's the best case scenario for an ice skater anyway? Right. And it's like, well, you know, there's Brian Boitano or like, all right, let's go down the chain a little bit. Like who's the most successful volleyball player of all time? And what was their—
Hold on there. Volleyball, I like you're talking to a Brazilian here, so volleyball is serious. No.
I knew soccer, but not volleyball.
Number 2 sport for us. There we go.
Really?
It is actually.
Got a lot of beaches, so I guess
yeah, no, but we happen to be very, very good at both indoors and beach volleyball. So just a twist on that. Now, you mentioned nature versus nurture, something that is in a lot of the circles that we interact with when you're here in Austin. We have some friends there involved, even in businesses, on this issue. Genetic selection. Just sort of an opinion. What's your take on it?
Very, very supportive. Absolutely. Definitely supportive of people's right to do it, but also to do it. And, you know, there are substantial costs, so it's not going to be something that lower middle class people are going to do. Still, you know, if you've got the money to go and either buy a new car every few years or do embryo selection using in vitro fertilization, yeah, I think in vitro fertilization is a really good move. Traditionally, this stuff was used just for genetic diseases, screening for that. That's actually been common for a long time. Now, though, there are companies where they are using statistical predictors of things like intelligence and personality to help you to get a better kid. There's a great slogan in the movie Gattaca where they say, look, it's still you. It's just the best of you. Like, yeah, totally makes sense to me. I mean, it is odd that someone who thinks that abortion is just fine, but thinks that it's wrong to decide which embryo to implant. It's like, how do you reconcile those two ideas?
There's one common friend of ours here that's working on this, that we had a meeting where somebody's like complaining. I'm like, no, what you're saying is it's just eugenics. And it's just like, yes, 100%. And and not like, not shying away from the word, right? Because people have such a loaded view of it. So I think that one of the issues there is that people have such a loaded view against something that, we already do. We just don't call it that. And
I think psychologist Diana Fleischman, another great nonconformist, has an essay where it says, look, what does it literally mean? It just means good genes. Are you against that? Anytime that you decide to have kids with someone who has good traits, you're practicing eugenics. That's right then and there. It's like, I don't want to have babies with guys like the guy like that. All right, that's eugenics.
All right, next, immigration.
Right. This is an area where, as you might tell from the title of my book, Open Borders, I am extremely pro-immigration, but the arguments that I focus on are very different from the ones that even most pro-immigration people use. Say the normal pro-immigration view in the US is foreigners, sure, they're probably a burden on us, but don't be a big greedy jerk. Just go and pay for them to be here, put them on welfare, especially in European countries like Sweden. It's like, yeah, like a good people, they just let in strangers, accept the fact they're not going to contribute, And that's our system. Like when you do that, then it's like, well, how many people can we just support on taxpayer dollars or kroner or whatever indefinitely? When I look at immigration, I see something very different. See, look, what is immigration? It's fundamentally about moving people from countries where their productivity is low to countries where their productivity is high. That is why it is that people primarily move, is to get a better paying job. If your welfare state is sufficiently egregious, then maybe you won't wind up getting a job. But still, the normal reason people are moving is to go to a place where they're making 2, 3, 5, 10, or 15 times as much money as they are back home. I look at that and I say, look, why would anyone want to stop this? It's not just saying I want to stop someone from lifting themselves up by their own bootstraps. It's also saying I want to deprive the world of that improvement. If a Mexican farmer grows 5 times as much food in the US than he does back in Mexico, it's not just that you are preventing him from having a better life, you're also depriving the world of all that extra food that guy is going to grow. So there's a lot of other people that are affected by this. I would say that through the non-conformist angle, I think the conformist view really is some kind of muted misanthropy where you just assume the worst of another person. Just figure, well, that person, why do we need that person? It's not nice to say, but yeah. And I just say, look, that's just factually wrong. The vast majority of adults are not only totally capable of supporting themselves, just put them in an environment where that is the obvious choice, and they take the obvious choice, and they do.
All right, so climate change, fossil fuels in particular. You've written a lot about this lately. That's
Yeah, so I'm good friends with Alex Epstein, who wrote The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels and Fossil Future. Just to give you a little background on this, when I first saw the title of his first book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, I didn't know anything about it or him. I knew that he was associated with the Ayn Rand Institute, people that I had previously had negative experiences with. Anyway, I looked at the title and said, that's just going to be a piece of right-wing hackery. I don't want to read that. Then I actually...
What was your prior on that issue, by the way?
Yeah, my prior was there are moderate problems caused from fossil fuels. It's probably a good idea to gradually move away from them. I mean, I already had a sense that nuclear power was the best alternative fuel. But nevertheless, when I look at that, I thought it was just going to be someone saying, like, man's nature requires fossil fuels. We cannot, these people that say that there are bad effects are just trying to destroy our great civilization. Right. So that's what I expected to get out of it. Then I started reading and like, it's actually quite good. And it's not dogmatic, takes takes other people's complaints very seriously, crafts an argument about, well, how are things on balance? So, I was a very big fan of that book. But anyway, then years later, I guess it's like 8 years later, something like that, he comes out with The Fossil Future. This time I look at the book and say, this is going to be good, but I don't need to read it because it's just going to repeat what the first book said. And so then it sat on my shelf for a couple of months. Then I finally got nudged to read it. Like, wow, this is much better than the first book. This is really good, really compelling. Like a lot of what he wound up doing in the second book that wasn't done nearly as well in the first book came down to things like, do you realize how big natural climate variation is? And I thought I did. And I read the book and it's like, do you know that sea levels are rising by a lot in some places of the world while falling a lot in other places? I'm just looking at this like, no, I didn't know that. I figured it's like a bathtub where all sea levels rise and fall together. And it's like, no, like some places are going up 20 or 30 feet. I'm like, 20 or 30 feet? Like, and then it's like, well, how do people deal with it? Well, guess what? They do. You don't hear about any major city being permanently flooded. Human beings are actually very capable of dealing with naturally occurring climate variation. And that naturally occurring climate variation is large. That's probably what I didn't really get. If you'd said, like, what's the coldest city on Earth and what's the warmest city on Earth, all right, I get that. But in terms of variation of every other kind in storms, sea levels, that kind of thing, I just didn't appreciate it. And then what Alex does in his book is say, look, so humanity used to die in very high rates from their struggle against this natural climate variation. Why were they dying in such high rates? Because the natural variation is really large. All right. But now hardly anybody dies from this stuff. Huh. And why is that? And his thesis was, well, they use modern technology, almost all of which is fueled by fossil fuels. It's like, huh. All right. And then from this, he's like, so will climate change lead to shifts in climate. Yeah, of course. Well, yeah, by definition, of course. Like, well, it could lead to some big ones, of course. But his punchline is, look, it would have to be outside the range that human beings have already proven themselves totally capable of dealing with. And this is an argument that's actually at first subtle, but the more you think about it, the more it does sink in that it's not enough to say that climate change is going to cause a bunch of problems. Sure, it's going to cause a bunch of problems. He'll also say it's also going to reduce a bunch of problems because sometimes you've got an area with bad climate and warmer is better. That's true too. But anyway, so climate change causes a bunch of problems. There are these problems that are outside this vast range that human beings have already managed to almost entirely master. There's this phrase, climate mastery. And that's where you really start thinking, well, what makes people think that we're going to be outside of this really big historic range? Yeah, they really don't have very much on that. There's catastrophizing of saying, well, it could, all right, but it would have to be really big in order to worry about it. And this is an argument that, from my mind, it did actually just handle a lot of objections simultaneously, and also just give you a framework for thinking about new complaints that come along. Someone says climate change is going to cause this horrible thing, right? So what's the natural variation already? Right? Is there natural variation? Well, the answer is going to be yeah, because there's always natural variation. How wide is natural variation? Safe bet to say it's really big. How many people are being killed by this problem now? In the modern world, almost none will be. Why not? Because we've got this great technology. Well, is the problem that you're talking about so far outside this range that it is naive to think that the technology that we already have is sufficient? I mean, another great way that he explains it is this. Economists routinely talk about adaptation to climate change, but when you say it that way, it sounds just like a pile of wishful thinking. It's like, well, we're going to take a climate that was already really good and then we're going to mess it up and then we'll adapt. It's like, yeah, that sounds hard to do. What Epstein says is, look, it's not that we start with a really good climate and then we mess it up and then we adapt for the first time. Rather, humanity starts with a climate that is pretty crummy overall. We already have figured out how to adapt to it. And what we need to do now is just adapt a little bit more.
Continuously adapting, which is
continuously adapt. Yes, which is what we're doing. Obviously, we're like, even if climate were not changing, we would hopefully be improving our adaptation to take the whatever lingering problems remain and getting them down to an even lower level.
It's almost like you would have to have a shift in the mean by 2 standard deviations, and the standard deviation is very high for all those issues already.
Yeah,
which is like nobody's predicting that, so it would have to be for anything catastrophic to happen, right?
Yeah, I mean, so like when he goes over things like, so what's considered a high forecast for changing global temperature? High forecast would be 5 degrees Celsius. And then you look, all right, so what's the average temperature in the coldest city on Earth? It's inhabited by 100,000 people. What's the average temperature in the warmest city on Earth inhabited by 100,000 people? And it's like, yeah, it's a lot more than that.
So that puts you in a very non-conformist position these days.
Yeah.
That's perhaps one of the. Now let's get to the last one, which is not only was very non-conformist for a while, but also resulted in direct actions that were very different. COVID.
Gee, I didn't know where you're going with that one, Carlos. Yeah, there I want to thank you for facilitating my non-conformism, Carlos, for helping out my whole family, making Austin so much fun.
Exactly. I had some help from the free people of Texas on that one, but go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. Like a lot of it was not even the laws so much as the attitude. That was what was so great about bringing my family to Texas for 3 months during COVID. Was there were people that not only had the freedom to hang out, but were happy to exercise it. My kids had people to play with. So COVID was something where in the very first couple of weeks, I was looking at the numbers and saying, like, maybe this is like that line where everybody's left the line and people are reacting so strongly. This is actually, for once, a really serious danger. And I really need to modify my behavior to keep me and myself and my family alive. Early on, of course, there's not a lot of numbers. And the numbers that you got, you're like, well, are these good numbers? Like, how are they doing it? Where are they coming from? Is it a reasonable sample? So, and I'll say for about the first 6 weeks of COVID, I was highly observant, though also constantly going and reading stat news and looking for other sources to get actual information about what's going on. And then once I had 6 more weeks of data, I just started saying, all right, so it seems like we got more data, and right, we got these infection fatality rates. Right? There's some issues of those, but still, the main issue there is we know the numerator of people that are dying from COVID. We don't really know the denominator of people who actually had COVID. But you can still, from there, you can say, all right, well, we got estimates. There's a range. There's a plausible range. Furthermore, very early it came out that there were two very strong predictors of susceptibility to COVID in terms of having bad symptoms. One of them was age, and that's where I was like, oh, damn, I'm 49. So I'm kind of right in the middle there. My kids look really good, so that's good. But then there's also the pre-existing health conditions, also very high susceptibility there. And there I said, well, I don't have any of those. So I went and started crunching numbers and put it together and said, oh, this is something where I am taking a few statistical days of my life off by going and living a normal life. I'm willing to risk statistical days of life for all kinds of other things. Why not this? A lot of friends got mad at me or said I was crazy. I mean, the only objection that I ever really got out of it was, well, you're only looking at death, but there's other problems that are caused by other long-term harms. So this is the early days of long COVID, probably before people realized how psychosomatic long COVID really is. But in any case, my reaction there is, look, of course there are other consequences besides death. That's also true for driving.
Or for staying home.
Pardon?
Or for staying home.
Yeah, but driving is like, look, dying and driving isn't the only bad thing that happen. You could get paralyzed. You could go and hit your head. You could get brain damage. Like you could lose an arm or a leg. There's all kinds of other non-fatal consequences of all these other risks. And yet still normally we start with the heuristic of what are the odds of death, and then we could multiply out some additional thing for non-fatal long-term consequences. Still, it isn't reasonable to single out COVID as the one special risk that you should take incredible care with, and everything else we just do the normal thing. So by about 6 weeks in, I just stopped conforming, and I started looking around for other people that wanted to hang out in real life and do things, and other people with kids that were allowed to play. And once we got into about 2 months, I just started profiling, like, you got kids? Can they play? All right. All right, our kids should play together.
Fantastic. Let's see here.
Just one other thing about COVID is, so let me this way. I'm not such a nonconformist that I was willing to be the first person in the airport who was breaking the mask rule. But when I saw 2 or 3 other people doing it, then I was like, I gotta show solidarity for my fellow nonconformists here, and just try it out. It was amazing to me how non-compliant people were. A lot of it was just plausible deniability. Somebody during COVID, I would just carry a water bottle with me in the airport. It's like, oh, I'm just drinking here. So there's that one. But also just notice that if you just keep moving, a lot of the problem with mask wearing came down to if you're immobile, someone will come bother you. But if you're on the run, then people are not going to actually chase you down and say, oh, sir, you have to wear a mask. And even if they do, it's like, fine. And then then turn a corner and take it back off again.
I remember, I think it's in the book, the essay on Be a Scofflaw, no?
Oh, yes.
That's one of my favorites. That was pretty fun. So I recommend people to read that one. Anyway,
this is the one where so it's the immigration connection is interesting because many people say, look, they should go and follow the law. It's like, well, do you follow all laws? like, do you drive the speed limit? It's like, well, no, but the speed limit's crazy. Like 55, you can't expect me to drive 55. And it's like, I agree, it's a minor inconvenience. It's the 55 mile per hour speed limit. It's not the dumbest law anyone ever wrote by a long shot. You are going and increasing the risk of harming others by doing it. You might say, yeah, but marginal benefits, marginal cost, it's still a reasonable thing. In the case of immigration, this is something where you could either go and stay stuck in Mexico earning $3,000 a year on a farm, or you break the law, come into the US, and you make $20,000 on a farm. It's like, can you imagine being a dad whose kids were hungry and saying, well, I got to respect the law here? It's like, look, you don't even follow the speed limit. So you're going to go and voluntarily let your kids go and be malnourished when you could just sneak through a fence and get a way better job and send the money home and get some pictures seeing that they're doing good? I wouldn't.
So, all right. You were a big history guy. So we talk a lot about history, all sorts of figures. You've read a bunch about lots and lots of things. Do you have so let me see if I can ask that question right. Is there a character in history that the conformist view is either very positive or very negative on that character, that you have a very clear opposing view of that character. Who would that be? Who would you make it a hero and is treated like a villain, or a villain that's treated like a hero?
Yeah, well, I'm very anti-FDR. That's some of it's conformism. Most of it is just my political views, and I'm so opposed to his political views. I mean, you could say that if I were conformist libertarian, I would still dislike FDR just for that. Let's see, like other figures that I would think of. Let's see, I think that the so-called robber barons of the 19th century get very unfair treatment. I'm not saying that they were uniformly great guys or anything like that. I think most of them were just very pragmatic people who got stuff done. Probably were not the nicest people in the world, but also not the meanest people in the world by any means. People who did very useful stuff, and they get maligned for doing great things. The idea of Rockefeller is so terrible for monopolizing the oil market. It's like, well, during this period, the price of the main product that oil was used for at the time, which was kerosene, by the way. So during the most of the time that Rockefeller had a large share, there's no gasoline being
There's no cars.
used. There's no cars. It's for lighting. It's kerosene. They're competing with whale oil. This guy gets so reviled, and yet we see that there's a huge fall in the price of this product, which pretty simply is owing to his incredible managerial talent at figuring out ways of squeezing more kerosene out of a smaller amount of resources in order to enrich the world. So, I mean, these are people that I think of as heroic without being necessarily great people. Right. So, they're like what's the right way of putting it? I think about it like Elon Musk, is he like the greatest guy? Like, can you see why his kids might not be that fond of him? I can see why his kids wouldn't be that fond of him. Same time to say, well, look, he's done tons of amazing things. Like, he's not like he's killed anybody or anything. Like, why is the people are so mad at him? Just because he is a normal person who does, at least a morally normal person who does extraordinary things, has great accomplishments. And that's where I see the rubber barons. The idea that they were like bad people because they're like making money selling kerosene. It's like, oh my God. I think there's the Samuel Johnson line saying a man is seldom so innocently employed as when he is making money. Totally applies to them. When people are tearing down statues, my reaction is often, yeah, why don't we tear down all the ones we got and just replace them with businessmen, scientists, people who actually did make great contributions to the long-term well-being of humanity.
I was going to tease you with Columbus, but you didn't mention Columbus. That's background, and Brian and I have some discussion on that before. All right, let's see if there's any questions in the audience, and then we can wrap it up. It's about
all right, cool.
An hour here. Anybody that's there live that want to ask anything?
Yeah, so you could either do chat room or you could pop up on the screen, right?
Yes. I think Chris, make sure that they can unmute themselves and talk.
Right. See.
Somebody in the chat here said
it's not a question.
Yeah, not a question. Yeah, but they should be able to unmute and talk. Let's see.
Right. Yeah, one thing we didn't talk about, Carlos, is my advice on how to be a non-conformist in a conformist world. I think it is true that non-conformists generally struggle in life because they're not strategic enough. And I'll say when I was young, I wasn't very strategic either. It's just a normal human trait to not be very strategic. A lot of what I advise people to do is just to pay attention to what happens to people who break a rule. Sometimes you really do get hammered down. In that case, I'll say, all right, respect that rule. On the other hand, you look around and say, yeah, maybe I can break it. Often helps just do break a small rule and see what happens. This was so much of what was going on during COVID is I'll just have the mask under my nose and see if anyone bothers me about it. All right, well, in that case, I can move it down further. In that case, I can take it off completely and just keep pushing your luck and see what happens.
While changing the probability of what? Maybe in changing like maybe at 3 seconds of your life expectancy or something like that, right?
Yes. And once I was told by a flight attendant on a plane that my sons were going to have a permanent complaint filed against them. And I didn't believe her, but I was thinking, I don't want my kids to be on a no-fly
have a record
because I'm a nonconformist. So, like, all right, kids, put them on. That lady means business, but probably didn't.
All right, so
we got some questions here.
Yeah, we got some questions here.
All right, so let's see here. What do we got? All right, so first questions, 2 questions.
Yeah, it's
cognitive tests actually undervalued and unstructured interviews overrated the market. think there's a lot of evidence for that. There is a book called The Handbook of Employee Selection. Chapter 1 is called Select on Intelligence. Chapter 2 is called Select on Conscientiousness, by which they mean formal personality test of conscientiousness. And the authors who know the literature very well say that these are the most effective. And on the other hand, unstructured interviews are very low, at least in terms
What
of.
book is that again? Can you mention the book again?
It's called The Handbook of Employee Selection, if I remember
Handbook of
correctly.
Employee
It's a
Selection.
very good book. Each chapter talks about one different tool, and it is ordered from best to worst, if I remember correctly. So intelligence is first. In my book, The Case Against Education, I do say, well, look, there is a good reason to worry about hiring a really high IQ person who dropped out of high school, precisely because they are likely to be dysfunctionally nonconformist. I don't think this was generally held by the authors of the book. I thought they didn't take that idea seriously enough. But still, the idea that unstructured interviews are not very useful, but to that. The only decent rebuttal, I think, is, well, the real point of an unstructured interview is to find out whether you'll get along with the other people. So if you are going to be the only person that works with this other person and you do an unstructured interview, you're like, well, the person's competent, but I hate this person. Like, well, that's not a good match, actually. You need, if you're like two people, if you hate another person, you don't want to be closely collaborating with them. For my graphic novels, I need artists. And if there was an artist who was just a giant pain in the neck, but was a great artist, I'd be like, damn it, why can't you be easy to get along with? Why do you put me in this dilemma where I have to go and make this trade-off? Yeah, but I do think it's very likely that that's true. Let's see. And then obvious high counselors, bias and actually harm the signal quality. Not so clear why unstructured interviews. The simplest story is precisely that you are looking for a likable person that you'll be able to get along with. And this goes two ways, right? You also want to make sure the person likes you, because one of the main issues with hiring is attrition. If given the amount of work it is to hire a person, if they don't say stay, you are out a pile of money. So part of what you're doing is seeing whether the person likes you. So that does seem reasonable. And I think probably at least a lot of the standard measures of job performance are not picking that one up, because normally they're measuring the performance of people who are there rather than looking at turnover and other measures. So maybe that's part of what's going on. Let's see, like letters of recommendation. Yeah, it is a farce. Some of it is there is a art to being able to read them, because people are generally very reluctant to actually say anything negative. So it's sort of the art of damning with faint praise and then interpreting the how terrible is this person based upon not someone not saying they're the best person ever.
By the way, let me just make a comment on this. It's one of my least favorite aspects of being an academic is that we have this letter of recommendations for both hiring and also for tenure. And the number of discussions you have in committees where people are like, no, you got to read between the lines. Like, what? How are we going to make decisions by us being able to read what's not written? I mean,
Yes.
we have psychics here. It's insane.
Yes.
Absolutely insane system. But anyway.
Yeah. So I was actually on the tenure promotion oversight committee, so I had to read way more letters than any normal person would. and although often I was there telling them, look, they're saying, oh, they say the person's good. And I was like, they have no specifics. They don't mention any of their papers. They don't put them in the reference class. This is a letter saying the person's terrible. And they're like, oh, I don't see that. Well, that's it's because you can't read, man. I think once or twice I did try giving the pedantic lecture. Look, everyone has a mafia. The mafia will lie for them. Our job is to try to see through the lies of their particular mafia. But that wasn't very welcome when I said it. Can't remember they actually used the mafia word, but it's worth doing. We're thinking about. Let's see, letters of recommendation.
Look at question 2 now. Move on to question 2.
Yes, okay, question 2. So let's see. Hold on. So let's see. Question 2. Free will. Let's see. Free will is likely due to probability. So actually, that is not the argument that I make. I don't say that free will is due to probability, because if you do whatever the roll of the die says, that's still not your free will. That is actually, you're just determined by a random process. So that is not actually an argument that I make. What I do say is this. If behavior is perfectly predictable, determinists would be running a victory lap and saying, yes, proves determinism is right. The fact that we don't have anything close to perfect predictions of behavior means that just in terms of basic Bayesian reasoning, it counts on the other side. If perfect prediction means that determinism has an argument in its favor, then lack of that means that determinism has an argument against. There's just no way around it. It's the same thing of, look, if a person wearing a yellow shirt shows that they are more likely to be fashionable, then not wearing a yellow shirt shows they're less likely to be fashionable. It's just the basic way that probability works. Okay, now, let's see here. So let's see many beliefs about that. The physics definition of free will is this, functional Kaplanian definition. So honestly, I'll say that I think the very best argument for free will is just simple introspection combined with the basic scientific principle. We don't throw out data because it contradicts our theory. Two things. So one thing is, like, you do introspection. It just feels like you've got free will. It feels like everything else in the universe could remain the same, and there's more than one thing that you are fully capable of doing. Some people I talk to, like Robin Hanson, says, I don't have that feeling. All right. It's like, okay, well, if you just don't have it, you don't have it. I suspect that you do, and that it's just the dogma of physics preventing you from acknowledging what you're seeing with what it was seeing in the eye of your mind. But anyway, like, if that's how you feel, then I've got nothing. But almost all people that are determinists say, yeah, it sure looks like I got free will. I feel it so much, but science proves that it can't exist. And this is where I say, well, what other kinds of observations do you throw away because the theory says they're impossible? And basic science is observations first. If we've got clear observations, then that counts. If it's just one weird fluke, then you say, well, maybe the instruments were off. If the instruments keep telling us the same thing all the time, year after year, you've got to take that seriously if you have a scientific mindset. So that is the heart of my case for free will. Don't throw out data. Right now, you can say, well, it's just an illusion. Can we throw out everything else illusion? Can we say it's just an illusion that the earth goes around the sun? No, because that's your eyes. Okay, well, why is it that my eyes are a reliable way of learning about the world, but introspection into my own mind is not a reliable way of learning about the world? Explain that to me. And honestly, as Descartes showed very convincingly, look, it is logically possible the external world is an illusion. It is not possible your own mind's an illusion, because by definition, if you're seeing your own mind, that is what it is. That is what it is for a mental thing to exist. You can't be wrong about being in pain. That is an infallible judgment that if you think you're in pain, you're in pain. It's like, no, you're making a mistake. Like, you can't be wrong about that. You can't be wrong about having a feeling or having an emotion or having a belief. The fact that you're having that experience is proof that it actually is happening. Whereas you really could be dreaming this whole podcast. That is at least logically possible, but you can't be dreaming that you're having a certain emotion right now. Like, an emotion in a dream is an emotion. That's my big case for free will. It does require saying that the physics textbook is incomplete, and I'm fine with that. Like, they just don't take the stuff seriously, and maybe with good reason, because it doesn't help them do anything they want to do. But in terms of living your life, saying, well, am I capable of doing something different given all pre-existing states of the universe? Sure seems like I can. Seems like I do. Seems like I'm doing it right now. I could shut up, but I'm not. Now I'm doing it. Now I choose to shut up.
All right, let's see if any other question here. I have one more. Okay, as people are thinking, maybe, so Bryan, you make bets a lot in order to, adjudicate some things that you make predictions. You like to make bets. What's the one that you lost that you're most embarrassed about? If there's any.
I have not lost any public bet. None. So I'm at 23 on public bets. There are two that I think I'm going to lose, but I haven't lost yet. Things could turn around. I've got a bet on AI saying that by, I think, like 2030, it's going to be able to get A's on 5 out of 6 of my own most recent tests. That hasn't happened yet, but it got A's on the last 2 tests that I gave it. So I've got to say, yeah, looks like probably going to lose that one. Then I also have a bet with Yoram Bauman on climate, and the bet basically requires that the average climate of the Earth be the same as it was during the previous something like 15-year period. I mean, I did this bet with good reason because there was something like a 17-year pause. And Yoram Bauman did give me odds. So I said, all right, well, I'm not really confident about this. But I don't think that much depends upon it, because per fossil future, it'd be okay for the world's temperature to rise by a couple of degrees. And yet the level of confidence that people had that this 17-year pause can't last. That seemed excessive to me. And so I did do that bet, and I probably will lose that. But essentially, it does require that we go into a period of cooling real soon for me to win it. So I probably will lose that one. In terms of off the record bets that I've lost, I actually bet Tyler that Osama bin Laden would be captured by, like, I'm trying to remember. I think I bet that he'd be captured by like 2003 or so. And then I lost, and then captured or killed. And then I lost, and we did double or nothing for another year, and I lost again. Now, then, as you know, it was like, what, 2011, where he actually does get caught. A cheesy person would say, see, I was really right. Like, no, you're not really right. There's a timestamp on the bet. To say, like, the bet of he'll be captured or killed eventually is a really different.
That's a really, he'll be killed eventually. I can guarantee you that.
Yeah, well, he'll die eventually, that's for sure.
Killed by something.
That is what is so cheesy about so much punditry, is they make a statement where when you think about it, it really can't be wrong. It's like World War III will happen eventually. Yeah, I'm afraid it will. Hopefully like 1,000 years from now, but I just don't see that it could not happen eventually, because eventually is such a long time. In fact, you might think the only way it won't happen eventually is if humanity goes extinct for some other reason. So perhaps you should be rooting for a future where World War III happens.
All right. Bryan, thanks so much for joining us. And again, if folks out there, the book that we're talking a lot about today is You Will Not Stampede Me, Essays on Non-Conformism by Bryan Caplan. Bryan, look forward to have you here in Austin again soon.
All right. Thanks very much, buddy. And yeah, you can get the book for $12 on Amazon, despite enormous inflation. I've been holding the line on nominal pricing, and you get the ebook for $9.99. And while you're at it, there's 4 earlier books of essays, and there are 3 more coming. One of them dedicated.
Are they an audiobook as well?
Let's see. So the answer is that I have a friend who's been using AI to do audiobooks, but Amazon won't tolerate such. So you have to go to some other website in order to get them. And I think that might still be not fully set up, but the audiobooks were made. I thought they were quite good. Some people were complaining about them. I'm like, man, I think this is pretty good. You're not happy with this.
Is AI speaking in your voice?
No, it's but you can
do that now. You can do that now.
Oh, that's cool.
It's pretty cool. Yeah,
well, that would be fun, right? And by the way, so one of the remaining books is going to be dedicated to you, Carlos. So get ready.
All right. Oh, thank you. Okay, so we can, I guess, stop the recording.